Great. Welcome, everybody. We're going to give it a few minutes for people to come on in, and we'll get started just after 5, given the fact that we're streaming live on YouTube, and we want to get you out of here on time, so we will start momentarily. But feel free to go ahead and use the chat if you want to make comments or introduce yourselves or do, again, running commentary. As we get into the discussion, if you have questions, please use the Q&A if you would like to be called on to ask a question or offer a comment out loud. I will offer those logistical announcements again in a moment. If anybody has any technical difficulties, you can feel free to message us through the chat by all means, and you can also pick up the stream through the Institute for Public Knowledge live stream on YouTube. And we'll get started with Ian in just a moment. I will also announce while we're streaming in is that for those people who are hearing impaired, there is closed captioning. So if you click the closed caption button at the bottom, we're very grateful to the captioners who've joined us, and they'll be captioning the event. So whether you're hearing impaired or just need a little extra help with the English, please use the closed captioning at the bottom. So why don't I go ahead and in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and just introduce myself and introduce what we're doing here, and then we will launch into the conversation with Ian. I'll repeat again some of the logistics in a moment for people who are coming in late. My name is Beth Novak. I am a professor at New York University and director of the Governance Lab and a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. GovLab and IPK are co-hosts of this wonderful series on the future of democracy, where we endeavor to have mostly optimistic conversations about innovations in government and in democracy. Ian, we need you today to take us from a dark place to a happy place by the end, since we always try to end up with some future vision for where we would like to be. So we're very excited for this conversation today, and we welcome you also. We will put links in the chat to sign up for future events. There's several upcoming that we'll put in announcements about, and we're just delighted by the fact that the silver lining of the pandemic is that we get to have so many people from all around the world participate in these conversations, and we are just grateful to you for joining us today. So again, from a logistical perspective, if you joined us late, by all means, use the closed captioning at the bottom for extra help with English, or if you're hearing impaired, we invite you to use the chat, please, for running commentary, introductions, etc. But please use the Q&A button at the bottom to either indicate that you'd like to ask a question, offer a comment, in other words, to be put in the queue. I will see you faster if you are in the Q&A. So let me kick this off right away and welcome Ian McDougall, and thank you for joining us. As those of you who already RSVP'd know, Ian is a lawyer as well as a journalist. He has written about crime and criminal justice and legal affairs for Harper's, The Atlantic, Slate, The Guardian, and as we'll discuss today, ProPublica, among many other outlets. Prior to attending law school, he was an Associated Press reporter with stints in Oslo, Norway, and in Providence, Rhode Island. And he's written on a wide variety of topics, and I commend his writing to you. He has pieces up there on ProPublica, for example, about the congressional fight over an investigation into potential conflicts of interest in the NLRB's efforts to undo the Obama-era rule that expanded liability for corporations. He has a wonderful piece on letters from detainees in one of America's largest jails on the mounting dread around the coronavirus. But we're here today to talk about a series of pieces that he's done, some tremendous investigative work that he and ProPublica have put together about McKinsey. the $10 billion management consulting firm with offices in more than 130 countries, 130 cities, and I believe 66 countries, if I remember the name correctly. We have, I believe, many former and perhaps even current people from McKinsey and other management consulting firms with us today, many of whom may, in fact, have worked in the public sector practice for McKinsey. And it's interesting that James O. McKinsey, I was just reading, who was a professor of accounting at the University of Chicago and who founded the firm in 1926, founded the firm because of inefficiencies in military suppliers that he discovered while working for the US Army Ordnance Department. So there's a history, a storied past, as well as a very lucrative present to McKinsey's work with the public sector. But we're only going to spend, and I say this up front to make sure I hold myself to it, that we're only going to spend the first part of our conversation laying out the allegations and evidence of corruption that Ian discusses in his series of articles in ProPublica. What I want to do is to very quickly shift to talking about very much what's not in the articles. And I know what Ian has given a lot of thought to, but is beneath the flashy headlines. Given the dozens of interviews, the thousands of pages of documentary evidence about McKinsey's work with governments around the world, what I'm hoping we're going to do is to really get behind the sensational headlines and to ask the harder and more nuanced questions, not particularly about McKinsey or management consulting, but about government. I'm hoping that we're going to discuss what the reliance on outside consultants actually means for the future of government and the future of democracy. And I should say, with full disclosure here, I'm seeing already people in the chat talking about confessing that they worked for McKinsey or work for McKinsey. Full disclosure, I hold a job in government working for a state, which, like many states you'll hear about, have hired McKinsey and other management consulting firms to do work on the COVID-19 response. So my office doesn't directly employ any McKinsey consultants, but I attend a lot of meetings with many very talented professionals from these firms who have been very, very helpful in these last few months. But we want to really probe together, not just with Ian, but with all of you who are here, what to make of their presence in such large numbers in government. So I confess, and this is a bit of my Chris Wallace moment, if you will, that it's going to be difficult, and that's why I'm being so confessional up front, to stay away from, for too long, the lurid stories of corruption that I want to dive into now. And to not talk only about this malfeasance and that you've been investigating, but to really try to probe what this actually means for democracy and for government. You know, Jamie Dimon famously said that the decision to hire McKinsey is political. It's for the purpose that if you make a decision, he said, you can say, it's not my fault, it's their fault. So we have to ask ourselves, is that what's going on? Is it the CYA strategy? Or in this era where there is a systematic and systemic effort to erode the capacity of government, denigrate the public service, and dismantle the analytic capacity of our institutions, does the hiring of so many outside consultants signal something, if not more pernicious, then at least something that's quite disheartening? So I'm going to dive in and ask a couple of questions of Ian, but I invite you again to please comment in the chat and to chime in on the Q&A, because I'm going to turn it very rapidly over to all of you to try to explore this in a conversation with him and with the many distinguished guests that we have joining us today. So Ian, welcome, and tell us, what got you interested in writing about McKinsey's public sector practice in the first place? This started first with an article about Mongolia. How did you get on this tear?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. That story, which did kick it all off, was one of those things that just sort of falls in your lap. Sort of a person who I've known for a while put me in touch with someone else, who put me in touch with someone else who had these documents related to charges that had been filed against some government officials in Mongolia that related to this project, railway construction project McKinsey had worked on several years back. So that then kind of spiraled from there. I talked to, gosh, it was tough because it's a 13-hour difference between Ulaanbaatar and New York, so it was a difficult reporting task, but ultimately managed to get a pretty good sense for what had happened there. And it was surprising to me, I suppose, to see a company that's sort of as at least in my mind, sort of venerable and untouchable as I thought McKinsey was, behaving in ways that seemed, at minimum, very, very sloppy. And as they, one of the lawyers working for them admitted, a way that they wouldn't behave today, especially after the problems in South Africa. So essentially what I found there is they had rushed into this, infrastructure project, which is sort of, those are famously hotbeds of corruption in a part of the country that the State Department, or part of the world, the State Department said had real problems with corruption, especially in that sector. They kind of rushed in, set up this consortium. It was a small project, but it could have become massive if it had actually proceeded beyond this sort of initial stage. And they hired a local company owned by the aide, a very close aide to the minister who controlled the project, which is a classic red flag. You almost should never do that. And then did some of this work, and then the project kind of fell apart. What they got, the problems came from was that the government, their prosecutors alleged that they had essentially inflated the contract. The insinuation was that they essentially paid a kickback through this local partner. I should say I never found, beyond the government documents, direct financial evidence of that kickback happening. I couldn't disprove it either. McKinsey, of course, said it didn't happen. But at minimum, it was a very sloppy move. I knew a little bit about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act from the sort of lawyer days, and it just seemed like the kind of thing where why would you get involved with this? And so from there, kind of started looking in the U.S., which is I mean, to be honest with you, it's easier to report in the U.S. than Mongolia. So that's kind of how things went from there.
And then there was a whole series of pieces that you did beginning last December. Was it conceived of as a series, or just tell us a little bit about how that unfolded and maybe about some of what you discovered in those pieces?
Yeah, it was conceived of as a series, though, it's the kind of thing where you start kind of looking around and talking to people, and you kind of identify a universe of potential subjects, some of which turned out to be, kind of wasn't anything there at all. Others turned out to be fairly troubling. So it's kind of initially kind of a gathering a bunch of material, talking to a bunch of people, and then kind of winnowing it to which projects seemed worthy of really truly reporting out and writing about. And so it kind of went from there. And parts of it are the timing of the pieces coming out just has to do with sometimes when you get to that person who will talk to you finally, or when you get that document that you needed. So that's sort of how that proceeded.
And so maybe just for those people who haven't read all the pieces, I'm sure many people have, but maybe you could just share a little bit. You've done reporting on what's happened at ICE. You've done indirectly reporting on what's happened in South Africa with the bankruptcy, with GSA. Maybe we just dive in a little bit on some of them and tell us first about what happened with ICE, which is probably the thing that's gotten the most headlines in the Times and elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that project, which had been sort of mentioned briefly in another Times piece, but just based on public contracting documents, no one really understood what had actually gone on there. Essentially what happened is the firm was hired initially by the Obama administration to do, was basically kind of how do we kind of overall make this agency a bit more efficient, I think was the idea. Then come January, the end of January 2017, the Trump administration issues these executive orders that, among other things, want to sort of ramp up how many people are in immigration detention. So they want to expand that capacity. They also want to hire 10,000 new ICE agents. And very quickly at the sort of, I think this is the end of January, early February, McKinsey hated that I said redirect, but it was, from everything I've heard, time and talked to people at ICE, people who worked there on the McKinsey side, looked at documents. The project really became focused on executing these executive orders. So figuring out how to hire these 10,000 new ICE agents and how to more efficiently use the space at a set of ICE facilities. And that included sort of trying to make the deportation process more efficient, things like that. And it troubled a lot of people at McKinsey. I mean, people who worked on the project. So it's not like it was, something that in retrospect looked troubling. There were a lot of people who felt very uncomfortable working on it. And they had to have these conference calls with the kids, the associates and business analysts and so on, to try to kind of talk them down. But they ended up making recommendations. At times even some of the ICE staff found a bit troubling, that were really sort of so focused on increasing efficiency that it kind of seemed to ignore some of the humanity involved, including costs. How much you spend on food and medical supplies and things like that. Most of those were not implemented. In fact, most of their suggestions were not implemented generally. Why that is, all kinds of institutional and other reasons, leadership turnover and things like that. But it was the kind of thing where I would guess that if the people at the top were to answer honestly, they would say they wouldn't do it again. It's not something they're necessarily very equipped to do. And yet they the money was pretty good, and it seemed like a contract they could kind of extend and extend and extend, which they did.
The ICE story is one of perhaps let's call it unethical behavior, a misalignment between the firm's values and what so many of the individual members of the firm would value, and this work which people arguably didn't want to be doing. A number of the pieces that you write, though, go quite a bit further in terms of allegations of financial improprieties, even further than the story in Mongolia. And maybe it's worth financial and other kinds of improprieties and irregularities. So although I do want to get past this discussion, I think we have to talk a little bit about some of the corruption that you discuss. So if you could tell us a little bit more really about what you found, and this was a series, so there seems to be some systemic practices. What's just going on in terms of the charging, in terms of the billing, in terms of the payments side of things?
Yeah, I think sort of the genesis of these problems is this desire to expand into new areas. So that's working on detention at, whether it's at ICE or at Rikers, moving into these areas that are very complicated, institutions that have very complicated and hard to crack cultures, and really do something that is very much unlike what McKinsey typically does. And the whole model of the consulting world is really to kind of get in and stay as long as you can. I know there's sort of they'll say that's not true, but you see it over and over again. It's kind of a how you stay until the client won't have you anymore. And so what ends up happening, I think sometimes, is in order for that next contract renewal to come through, the partners or the EMs, the engagement managers, will kind of do what the client wants them to do, and sometimes, like at Rikers, that could be a real problem, where they early on were essentially gaming these pilot units they'd set up to try to reduce violence at Rikers by putting non-violent inmates in there. But then when they presented that publicly to the Board of Corrections, for example, they wouldn't disclose that aspect of it. Eventually that kind of got taken over by the Department of Correction, and they started doing that on their own, I think, but a bit more. But it's kind of both a wanting to kind of tell the client what they want to hear, but then also I think what happens sometimes when you embed in these clients is that you do start to sort of, through osmosis, adopt some of their internal culture and sort of sense of the world, which this is kind of more of a, I guess, people may have different ideas about this, but the culture of the Department of Correction in New York City is quite has a long history of problems, and the same is true at ICE. So I think it's a combination of wanting to keep the contract going as long as you can, but then also just the nature of the work. You end up making recommendations that maybe in sort of a more neutral context you wouldn't make.
I want to push back for a second on your comment that this is not what they're used to doing. Obviously, there was no history for working directly with the incarcerated, but to the extent to which the recommendations are around how to save money on the care of immigrants in detention, or the question is how to hire 10,000 ICE agents very rapidly. Isn't this in many ways sort of trying to apply cookie cutter kinds of prescriptions and recommendations that they do for companies all the time and just apply them in a public sector context?
Yes, and so I mean the hiring one, for example, is one where I wouldn't say that that's outside of their general. I think people were uncomfortable with it because they were uncomfortable with the underlying policy goals of that. I do think there's a distinction though when it comes to. So I agree that the idea of sort of cutting costs and efficiency and all that certainly is what management consultants do a lot. But what they tend not to work in environments where the cutting of costs may have a serious effect on a human life. So I'm in jail, I'm in ICE detention. I'm not really part of the equation, in part because ICE doesn't always see it that way. But especially looking at some of these slides in the ICE context, there seemed like there was this kind of disconnect between the recommendations about cutting costs, which if this was just they were talking about a factory that produces widgets, okay, but they're talking about a situation where that would have very serious ramifications for human health and life potentially. And both from talking to people and looking at a lot of the documents, I didn't see a lot of evidence that was considered very deeply.
I'm really curious from your perspective what they bring to the equation. You write about the New York City corrections context and the recommendations that were made for Rikers. The city paid $27.5 million only to abandon much, if not all, of what the firm recommended. What was the feeling? What do you think they needed them for? I mean, the recommendations were things, frankly, as obvious as we should provide more educational opportunities for inmates, or we should improve staff training. You don't have to pay me $27.5 million to come up with that. I would do that for $26.5 million.
Right.
So I'm just curious what you think. Is it the Jamie Dimon rationale of the, pardon my French here, the cover your ass political cover, or what was the feeling about what in your talking to all the people on the government side of things, what's the value that is perceived to be brought as a result of bringing in management consultants?
Yeah, so the Rikers example is a good one for talking about that, because it has, I think there are two answers. One, they were hired at a moment in 2014 when there was a lot of press attention to the surging violence at Rikers. I mean, it was really, people had kind of ignored it, as the Bloomberg administration ended. But then looking at people suddenly, de Blasio's first year in office, were looking at these numbers and saying, my God, this is, people are, being brutal to, I mean, it's just awful. And guards being, brutalizing inmates and everything else, detainees. And so there was a need to, it's kind of that do something pressure that any political actor gets at some point when there's either some big news event or, like COVID, a crisis gets sort of foisted on you. And so, they were available. They are a big name. There was people within government, told me that a lot of it was they wanted to be able, it was nice to be able to say, hey, we hired McKinsey. The problem's going to be fixed. Don't worry about it anymore. And so, that kind of temporarily ends the conversation potentially, but then you come back 2.5 years later and say, well, what the hell was that all for? The second answer is that City Hall has always struggled, much like we see now with them struggling with the NYPD, has always struggled with the corrections department. It is, much of it is literally on an island, separated from the rest of the bureaucracy, and hard to get to. And there's a deep and long-standing culture of corruption and brutality there. And so there was a lot of mistrust of the people who were at sort of the middle to upper levels of management. And they couldn't just fire everybody. So bringing in McKinsey was kind of a way of diluting out, or maybe marginalizing some of those people and having McKinsey do it instead, or having a 25-year-old recent college graduate do that sort of thinking and work instead. And that, on some level that could be fine, but they're still operating inside this bureaucratic culture that is going to try to oppose them when they have good ideas, and may try to facilitate the more troubling ideas. So I think those are really the two things that drove that. And I think that those two things are ones that you see in a lot of, not just McKinsey, but consulting contracts in general.
Same rationale or different in the circumstance of COVID? You report on how in the first 4 months of the pandemic, governments in the United States spent $100 million on McKinsey's fees. Uh, Similar view on what's going on there, or in, for example, the Mongolian case, or different?
Um, I think very different from Mongolia. I think you don't, at least I haven't seen a lot of that kind of issue in the U.S. For a variety of reasons. Just more oversight. It's harder to enter into those kinds of situations. But yeah, I think that from what I understand from my reporting, there was it varied. I mean, there are a lot of contracts across the U.S. With McKinsey. Some of it's understandable. I mean, this a pandemic suddenly kind of comes out of nowhere, and you feel underprepared, and you want some smart people in the room. That's understandable. Given the kinds of things they were doing, which a lot of it was fairly basic, kind of aggregating models, setting up dashboards, things that are important, but you have to ask yourself, and this isn't McKinsey's fault, you have to ask yourself why can't the government do that? That seems like a core thing the government ought to be able to do. And one of the primary reasons we have government is to protect people in a crisis. And if a serious crisis, but if the government is so hollowed out and so incapable of doing these very basic IT tasks or whatever on their own, that's a pretty troubling indictment to my mind of the state of government in the United States. Now, there are other contracts where I think there was more of the cover your ass approach, or not trusting the civil servants you're working with if you're a political appointee or a governor or a mayor. So when there's that many contracts, it really varies a lot. And some of them, I guess, are maybe, I set aside the Mongolia thing, but the contract they had at the Department of Veterans Affairs, there's more to learn about that, but there's some very cozy revolving door stuff going on there with a partner named Scott Blackburn, who had been at McKinsey, gone to the VA, and then gone back, and had a number of communications with the person who then essentially overnight assigned them this multi-million-dollar contract to basically run the COVID response, as sort of a shadow team there, essentially. And I haven't followed up on it, so I don't know exactly how it's going, but it was that is perhaps a bit more troubling in terms of the how that contract came to be.
So we have so many good questions coming in, and people who are messaging me that they want to talk. So I'm going to ask you one more thing, and it really picks, and then open this up. It really picks up on what Mike Flowers, currently in the innovation office in New Jersey, former chief analytics officer for New York City, is asking in the chat, which is about the ways in which this retards, as he puts it. Let me read his comment. There's so many things that have come in. Here we go. Don't the existence of these services retard the development of core competencies among permanent staff and civil service? And so that's really kind of the question that I want to get to, is sort of, is this a bad thing? And let me complicate it a little bit more. The growth of McKinsey's public sector practice is really coincident with the rise of the ideology of smaller government, with the whole notion of new public management, with the idea of copying business practices in government. And so I'm just wondering whether, in the same way that McKinsey has been blamed or credited, depending on who you are, with really perpetuating certain views of capitalism in its business practices, in sort of really trying, as kind of the connective glue and the knowledge management tissue that really connects one company to another and perpetuates a certain set of practices. Whether this is part and parcel of this larger trend around new public management, around the sort of smaller government ethos. Is it the dog or is it the tail in this equation, do you think? And do you find it troubling or not?
It's sort of both. So if you'll humor me with a bit of deeper history on McKinsey, you mentioned James O. McKinsey and his work with the military. There's a guy named John Corson who set up the DC office for McKinsey in the 50s, who was very much of a certain kind of evolving, at that time, certain sector of the mostly Republican Party, though across party lines, belief that has become kind of what you're talking about, the sort of Reaganite view of small government. And he had very particular beliefs about that, essentially, and I haven't dug into him enough to really know where they come from, but sort of that businessmen as some kind, and it was men at that time, had some kind of like, just great genius that if you just, sort of get rid of all the middle management in government, put the businessmen in, everything would work out so much better. And so he spent about 10 years, a little more than that, really pushing this idea in different projects in government. And finally, at the very end of the 50s, when NASA was getting set up, the administrator there had sort of similar ideas, hired McKinsey. And one of the reports they put out had recommended that NASA ought to essentially have only a skeleton crew of federal employees and otherwise just contract everything out. And by the next year, I think they'd contracted something like 85% of their work out to various aerospace contractors. And that sort of pattern is followed in other agencies, certainly the Pentagon, the military industrial complex and so on, which, McKinsey is also involved in that. But that project really, I wouldn't say it's the sort of genesis of it, but it was very much a part of starting this trend towards let's hollow out government and rely on the private sector because, government employees are suckers and lazy, and we need the sort of the superhuman businessmen to come in and fix everything. And what happens from there, and this is where it kind of feeds into politics, is once you start doing that, you get the government that you always thought you had. If you're an anti-government person, right? You get rid of some aspect of government. Suddenly, it doesn't work that well. So you can say to the public, look, the government doesn't work that well. Let's get rid of more of it, more of it, more of it. And that proceeded up until pretty recently. And McKinsey has then been a part of, to answer the question from the audience, a part of that, not so much as sort of in a motivating kind of way, but when you talk to people who worked alongside McKinsey in government, and it varies, but often when a political appointee brings in McKinsey to kind of shunt aside the career employees, maybe there was a good reason for that, maybe not, but it's just demoralizing. It's not, for a lot of people, it's just kind of like, why can't this is, I have the expertise in this, I know how to do this. Why are you bringing in a 25-year-old who thinks they can do it better than me? And maybe sometimes they can, but if that then just, as the questioner said, I think just kind of perpetuates sort of bad practice in government, and it demoralizes civil servants. If they think, what the hell am I here for? I'm just shuffling papers around. When something real happens, they'll bring in the consultants. I wouldn't want to stay on that job or take it seriously.
Great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to paste the queue here so that everyone can see. What we're going to do is to promote you to panelists so you can ask your question. And in the meantime, while Sam's doing that, I'm just going to flag there's 2 anonymous questions now, which is totally fine. The first one, I don't know if you know the answer to, so I'm going to read it to you, and we'll see if anybody in the chat wants to answer it, which is, has anyone done an analysis of how many FTEs, Fed or state, a McKinsey contract would cover? Caps on government staffing have left agencies shorthanded, and consultants may be seen as the only ways to fill in those gaps. So I'll also put that in the chat in case other people have an answer to that. We have lots of smart people here. So, and any answer to that?
I'd be curious to hear if someone knows of a study that would be really interesting. I don't know of a study, but yeah, I think that is a reason why they're hired a lot, is that there's a pot of money for contractors that's often quite a bit more flexible and quite a bit larger than the money for hiring somebody. But the one kind of analogy I can draw is in Miami-Dade County with the COVID work. There were 2 sort of mid-level staffers doing this prep work to reopen the economy there, and I looked up there. In Florida, you can look up government wages. I think if I remember correctly, their combined annual salary, which was not small, I think it was something like $70,000 a year, was less than 1 week of having like 2 or 3 McKinsey people doing basically the same work. That is probably not how things ought to work.
Great. I'm going to pass the mic now to Anita, professor at the Rotman School of Business and a self-professed, confessed ex-McKinsey consultant for the first go around.
Ian, it's so wonderful to meet you. Thank you for your talk and
Thank
for
you.
the fine work you've done. I wanted to distinguish problems at three levels. First, there are problems at McKinsey that you've described that may be reflective of the evolution of capitalism and the way that our society is organized in general. Perhaps elitism, the idea that 25-year-olds coming out of these elite institutions would have insights that, Beth has just characterized as relatively, obvious insights about, for example, what ICE could or should do to support development. So one is that sort of culture of which McKinsey is a part. The second is problems of governance in the private sector, where you have many of the same problems that you've described for the public sector. In other words, you get new leaders coming in wanting to do a CYA in terms of trying to, blame somebody else for the problems that they've inherited or that they see that they believe that they've inherited, and then problems that are unique to the public sector. As you describe the overall portfolio here of issues that are of great concern, how much of those problems is attributable to each of those three sources? How much of this is kind of a McKinsey specific, really a broader challenge of kind of industrial capitalism and its elitism? How much of it is organizations are not being governed very effectively right now, given digitization, and there are CYA problems and things like that all over the place in all sectors? And how much of this is specifically a public sector issue?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess on starting with the first, the sort of the overall culture aspect of it, that is certainly a part of it. I'm trying to think of, well, I'll jump to actually the second one first, if that's right. The question about governance, both in the private sector and the public sector. I do think, and I don't know that I can point to this is the person for whom this is the paradigmatic example, but there's a lot of the revolving door in government goes in both directions. And so I think sometimes the bad habits that, executives are learning in the private sector, they bring with them when they go into government in the public sector. And so, yeah, they're doing the same, this sort of, I'm going to make an unpopular decision. I want to be able to blame the consultants, or I don't trust the people who are working under me. I'm going to gradually clear them out. But in the meantime, let's bring in consultants. And so I think that those two are very much connected to each other. I think going back to the first part of the question, this kind of goes back to what Beth and I were just talking about a minute ago. I think a big problem has been, this is surely a reductive and oversimplified expression of this, but the extent to which wages have changed, the wage disparity between public and private. It's this is a different kind of consulting, but like the Booz Allen Hamilton model, where you just have the intelligence community and military, which is like half contractors who used to work for the government who are now being paid twice as much to come back. And it's just the question to me is like, why don't the government just pay their employees more? Especially the federal level, government isn't like the private sector. They don't have a sort of finite amount of money and so on. So anyway, that's a much, and there's sort of probably more complicated answers to that part of the question. And the third part, I guess I'm trying to distinguish the part that you said, just the public sector, and tell me if I haven't fully answered the first two, or I may not have.
No, there's a lot of other people in the queue behind me who have fascinating questions that pick up on pieces of this. But no, I think your answers really reflect the nuance here in a way that's really important. So thank you for that. I want to turn to the next questions here to deepen this conversation.
Sure. Let me encourage also, we have lots of smart people here who have answers, not just questions. So yeah, please keep it coming in the chat. And we will have also at 6 o'clock, we turn it to a free for all where everybody gets to answer all the questions too. And we let Ian play his usual role of being an investigative reporter and questions instead. Sam, another current government, former McKinsey.
Yeah, and I think yeah, thank you. It's such a fascinating discussion, and Anita, I think that discussion that you just had and the question that you raised is so interesting, and it's so fascinating to me that we're seeing at the moment how brilliantly capitalism and a business approach is working in the whole world. And that's the choice that we're making as public servants, is to go back to that instead of embracing new stuff. But I was really interested in, from your work, is the extent to which you've got any thinking or ideas about how, because some of the there's a lot of new perspectives and brains that can be brought to bear in the consulting context. And I was just interested to see if you'd seen any models or have any thinking about how those could be better used in the government context, acknowledging that the people who are in there are the people who have to do the work and who own the problem.
Just the first part of it, some of those other ideas in consulting, I'm curious I'm not sure I know exactly what.
Look, I just mean more like the consulting model as a whole is how do we modify it to become more of getting the value of the fresh eyes and the value of the, that there is value in 25-year-old brains,
Sure,
as long as we acknowledge that they don't necessarily know everything. Like, how do we bring that to bear usefully in a government context? And if you've seen any constructs where that consultancy partnership has been more productive and sustainable.
I've spoken with Beth before about this, but there are these models of sort of having almost in-house consultancies within government, right? You get the same benefit of having someone who is not, embedded or sort of stuck in an agency culture, who has a fresh set of eyes, and who may be, someone who's on the recent out of college side and is not going to stay there forever. That to me seems like it eliminates a lot of the incentive, sort of bad incentives about, the thing that really, to me, it seems like a McKinsey can have a lot of value in government. If there's a question like, so Bob Mueller, who actually really brought McKinsey back into US public sector consulting, needed after 9/11 to restructure the FBI based on a new set of priorities. Depending on the situation, you can ask whether management consultant's the right one to do that. But if it's sort of come in, reorganize this place based on these set of principles, and then you're gone. You're not going to get to stay beyond X date. We're not going to re-up your contract. That could be, that could be very valuable. And it's kind of like hiring a construction crew to do construction work in the government. You know what I mean? It's like, the problem is once they get in and just stay there. And if that's going to be necessary, then I think there's a need to reconceive a lot of how we structure government agencies, but also, some of these ideas about having kind of in-house consulting type firms within, or consulting type agencies or components within government, could give you a lot of the benefit without a lot of the downside.
With Brian's indulgence, I'm gonna jump around because Bernie's question in the queue is directly relevant to what you're just saying. So I'm wondering if you want to, real quickly, if you want to ask it, Bernie, because I think this question about tours of duty here is really relevant. And then I'll come back to you, Brian, in 2 seconds. Bernie, you're muted. Oops. Since we can't hear him, I'm going to point you in the Q&A to his question where he asks about especially with regard to the VA case, how do we encourage people from the private sector to take a tour of duty in public service if they're then going to be accused of self-dealing when they go back to their private sector jobs? So I pick up on that only because it's directly relevant to your comments and your discussion here about creating consulting practices within government, potentially then bringing in people to do these tours of duty. Do we run the risk of what Bernie is suggesting?
I mean, I guess I don't know why we need people to come in for those tours of duty. I mean, that wasn't always the model of government in the US, and it isn't the model of government in a lot of other places. There's some value to it, but I've just never really understood. And I think that the tide is starting to turn a little bit with, the Obama administration was a bit harder on the revolving door than prior administrations. And obviously this administration's a different thing altogether, but, it's not clear to me that there is a healthy way to have, I'll give an example that I know fairly well in the legal world. You have, and my colleague Jesse Eisinger has written about this, book called The Chicken Shit Club. I don't know if you can say that. But, you have a lawyer, starts an associate at Cravath, goes to the government to do white collar prosecutions at the US Attorney's Office, but always has in the back of their head, I'm going to go back and be a partner at Paul Weiss. A lot of their big institutional clients are banks, big financial institutions. I'm not going to want to really nail those guys to the wall the way they might deserve in a certain case, because that might complicate my future career opportunities. That, I mean, I don't think there's a way around that. And it's even worse in the situation where you come out of government and then there's a way for you to kind of get back in, I guess. So my analogy falls apart a little bit there, although the defense bar prosecution thing maybe is close to it. But I don't, I think if you're coming from a consulting firm into government and going back to the consulting firm, I don't know why you should be allowed to have anything to do with that agency ever again, at least not for a long time.
Okay, I'm gonna move now to Congressman Baird, Brian Baird, former congressman from the state of Washington.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks, Ian, for the great analysis and to all the great questions people have offered. It strikes me that this is sort of part of the evisceration and the denigration and the demoralization of the federal workforce. And that really began in the Gingrich era. And I talked to people, for example, in USGS, which had a headquarters in my district. They talked about they would often do 14-hour days because they loved the work. I mean, they didn't do it because they got rich. They did it because they were passionate about their science and the need in the public mind. And if you're doing that work and somebody's calling you corrupt and deep state and all this other stuff, and then you're seeing somebody like McKinsey rake in a lot of money, it's just pretty demoralizing. And then so I'd be interested in your comment on that. The other part is we have other entities like the National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine, the National Academy of Public Administration, the GAO, et cetera, that traditionally, at the federal level anyway, people turn to. And the states have a little less of those resources. But if we're going to McKinsey, how do we know McKinsey is being objective? How do we know they don't have conflicts of interest that you've just discussed? There's sort of this idolization of the private sector and denigration of the government sector. So if you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, those are both really good points. And I start with the second one. I mean, there are certainly instances of actual conflicts of interest, but also, the consulting model is especially one where there's a potential to kind of stay there for a long time, and bonus incentives and so on are based on kind of money you bring in as a partner. I mean, there's a lot of incentive there to tell the client, and by which I mean the person who hired you, not necessarily the client as a whole, the agency, kind of what they want to hear. It may not be what really is the best answer. And I've certainly seen many examples of where that happens. And that's not just McKinsey. That's the sort of the nature of that kind of structure. And so I don't think there's really a great way around that, unless you have sort of hard cutoffs for how long you can stay, things like that. I mean, you could build in guardrails, I guess, but it's pretty tough to get rid of that incentive. And I don't mean to say that, I don't mean to denigrate individual partners or anything. I mean, I would believe that most people in these positions think they're doing the right thing for the right reasons, but there's all kinds of sort of subtle biases that can work their way into our thinking. And on the first point about demoralizing, federal workers, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea that the solution to sort of the problems that we've created in government over the years, sort of the Gingrich and the Reagan, and before that, other administration, I mean, the Kennedy administration actually did a fair bit of that. The Clinton administration did a fair bit of that. So I didn't mean to make it sound like a partisan thing. That the sort of the solution of that now seems the easy solution is let's just hire consultants, where it seems like the more sustainable solution is like, well, we should reverse some of those problems. Pay federal employees more, make the work. And I don't know how exactly this would be sort of situation dependent, make it more appealing. And frankly, if you put in place restrictions on the sort of ability to revolve in and out of government in ways that can create conflicts of interest, in ways that can kind of make you, while you're in government, have your eye on something else down the road. That can probably go a long way towards helping that too. If you can't take your sort of relationships in government and use them in any way for 5 years or 10 years, there's a lot less incentive to kind of think about, how am I going to use what I'm doing now, the people I know now, to make a bunch of money when I go do something else. And also there will hopefully be, less of the sort of demoralizing influence of seeing, people like that come in making 5 times what you're making or more than that, to do basically the work that you're doing sometimes better, sometimes worse. So, you know, but those are both really good points.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Let's bring Pallavi into the discussion, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Pallavi Nuka. I'm calling from Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs, formerly known as the Woodrow Wilson School. Just, you know, it's fascinating to listen to this discussion. Thank you, Ian and Beth. So I just had a question that's been answered in part already about this public-private wage gap. And also consequently whether or not you think that there's a skills gap. I mean, you've already talked a little bit about private sector wages being much higher than public sector, and you know, consequently, do you see more skilled individuals entering the private sector compared to the public sector based on some of the research that you did for your reporting? You know, from a public coming from a school of public policy, we're educating a lot of students to go enter the public sector. They're extremely enthusiastic, extremely talented, and you know, I wish there were more of them.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, I think the answer is the unsatisfying. It varies. So you know, just like for example, the Justice Department is home to some of the finest lawyers in the country. Because well, there's all kinds of reasons, but I mean, it's, you know, if you want to do the sort of work of a federal prosecutor, it's not really anywhere else you can do it. It's maintained its sort of sheen and prestige in a way that other government agencies have not. And so, you know, in some of those other agencies, I suspect for a wide variety of reasons, there may be a skills gap. I mean, one thing that's interesting about consulting on the skills gap is, you know, it's kind of like, you know, when you are a sort of first or second or third year, I mean, you don't really have any skills at all. I mean, you know, I've talked to you know, McKinsey people who said, you know, the first year I barely knew how to like run a regression on Excel. I was kind of just figuring it out as I went. Which, you know, and that is, I mean, I should say that's one of the values that a McKinsey or like law firms have, is they can train, you know, in a couple of years, someone to at least do serious work and do it seriously. So there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it's not, you know, I don't know. I haven't seen a lot of examples in McKinsey's work, and I suspect this is true across consulting, where the people who are being brought in have some set of substantive skills that the people in the agency don't have. Now, there may be, you know, this fresh set of eyes. There may be ideas about how to organizational theory kind of things that people in the agency either don't see or just don't know anything about. But yeah, it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer for it. But I think it just, you know, probably varies. You know, science is around an example where the government has really great scientists, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But I think if you work at, well, the VA is a good example. They get, you know, sort of trashed all the time by politicians on the left and the right, and you know, it's a very politically volatile place to work. You know, and it's kind of thankless. I think they have a harder time attracting people who want to do that work. I shouldn't say that across the board, but that's just an example that comes to mind. And it's not really well, some of it might be the agency's fault, but it's also just sort of you know, these agencies that are punching bags for you know, to score political points, be it on the right or the left. I think those agencies, there probably is more of, if not a skills gap between, you know, sort of say consultants coming in and not, but people who would say to themselves, gee, I'd like to do that work at the VA, but it sounds absolutely miserable and dysfunctional. So I'm going to go do it at a hospital, a privately run hospital instead. I suspect there are a lot of agencies where that's true.
Right. We have some great questions, but I'm wondering if they want to ask them out loud. James, Sherry, are you there?
Yes.
You want to ask one of your questions aloud?
Yeah, maybe at this point, after all the details that we've discussed, that this question is a bit too general and a bit abstract, but a lot of this seems to revolve around the question of the cultural support for self-interest versus professional responsibility. And is there a way to highlight the former and highlight the latter and decrease the former, or is financialization something that America has simply bought into and will never escape from?
In the consulting, yeah, it's a really good question. I think in the consulting context, the consulting and McKinsey, Marvin Bower, who was James O. McKinsey founded it, but he's really the guy who shaped it. They went out of their way to avoid ever being regulated externally in any way. And not just, the whole industry. There's no bar like there's for lawyers or AMA or whatever for medicine. I do think if you had regulatory structures that could reach how people in those sectors are doing their jobs, you may have that may solve some of the. I don't think it would, solve all of the problems that are there. Because you see it in law too, even though the bar exists. But yeah, I do think that having a sort of completely an industry that is unanswerable to anybody, and frankly, it's offended when anyone starts asking questions about them. That's kind of the worst situation you can have, which is sort of the one that exists right now. But how you would create a regulatory structure, say for the consulting world that works and isn't just sort of a mess like a lot of regulatory sort of systems are now. I don't know. That's I guess the nice thing about being a journalist is I just get to tell the stories and not necessarily have to come up with the solutions.
I'm going to give what probably will end up being the last formal question to Bernie. Introduce yourself. Meanwhile, we will put a notice about the next events in the chat, and we don't end at 6, we just end the live stream, and then we have the off the record equivalent of happy hour that follows, where Ian gets to ask you questions.
Well, thank you, Beth. First, Ian, I just wanted to thank you for your sustained attention to this issue over multiple articles over multiple years. It means a lot. And I kind of want to build on what James was just mentioning around professionalism or professional standards. The genie's already out of the bottle in terms of, Reagan years, or even go back to Eisenhower, about moving so much work over to consultants. But one thing we do with federal employees, state employees, local employees, teachers, is there is an ethical principle that they're asked to operate under. It applies in soft ways in terms of things you don't put on your Facebook page, and it acts in hard ways or symbolic ways in terms of saying the constitutional oath. We don't ask our contractors to do that. And I wonder, and it's not really the symbols of saying the oath, but rather the broader principle. Do you see any examples out there where the public sector is asking industry from day one to act like public servants? The place that immediately comes to mind, or the sort of the context that comes to mind, which is maybe an imperfect example, is in the intelligence community, where you are bound by, you get a clearance, you are bound by your NDA to not disclose classified information. And with some very high profile exceptions, you don't see a lot of leaks out of Booz Allen Hamilton or whatever. That people do seem to take that quite seriously. In part because they will go to prison almost certainly if they don't. But I'm trying to think if there's a less severe, and frankly, the classification system's kind of a mess anyway. But example, I don't know. I guess probably the other place that comes to mind is, again, in the sort of military and intelligence community, where you have all these, they're consultants, but they're often former employees who are now getting paid 3 times as much to be employees again. But yeah, I don't, when you have a situation where the incentive is to like sell, because that's, your incentive is, you probably feel some moral obligation to your client to do what's right by the government and be public spirited. But there's also, the pressures of you got to answer to the partnership. That's really hard to, there probably are ways to do it, and probably are examples of that. I can't think of them. I'm sorry, my cuckoo clock has gone off a little bit. I can't, as I sit here, come up with a good example. Can you think of any? I can't. I'm just not hitting on any good examples.
I'm gonna before you ask that back,
sure.
Bernie, in the interest of time. Sorry, it's a little your cuckoo clock reminds me of Trump. down there. It's a little hard to focus now. What I want to do is to thank everybody who's on the live stream and watching us on YouTube, and to formally close out the formal portion of the event. What we're going to do is, if anybody wants to stick around, we're going to promote everybody to panelist, so that you can now again talk to one another, talk to Ian, and we will stick around as long as his next deadline will allow us to keep